All of this taken together leads to huge environmental damage in the region. Those who stayed in the cotton producing region had major health issues. They were exposed to higher doses of chemicals, pesticides, defoliants, fertilizers. Even people living around the process had increased rates of morbidity. They were far more likely to suffer from disorders of the nervous system, hepatitis, typhoid, and other diseases. Mother's milk is now harmful, something that companies like Nestle may love to hear, but it has a very negative impact on life. In fact, infant mortality rates were the worst in the Soviet Union, partly as a result of all of these environmental problems. Also remember that you need lots of labor to collect cotton. But in Central Asia, you began to have labor problems under the Soviet period. There were lots of reasons people wanted to get to the cities and away from the cotton business if they could. And this leads to a reliance on forced labor, something that continues to be the case today. Now, the environment is critically intertwined with economic development. And often when there's environmental damage, you have lots hoping for an end and none willing to pay for the costs involved to the end. So water is a big one in Central Asia. On the one hand, you've got depletion, and on the other hand, you have excess. The Amu Darya in southern Uzbekistan, Sir Darya, do I have the map here? There we go. So this is the Amu Darya down here, and this is the Sir Darya running from Tajikistan through Uzbekistan into Kazakhstan. These rivers feed the Aral Sea, but they also feed much of the agriculture. So the Sir Darya goes this, there we go, this long roundabout way into the Aral Sea, and then the Amu Darya goes this direction into the Aral Sea. So both of these feed the Aral Sea, but they also feed much of the agriculture of Central Asia. Now, Turkmen use the 1,300-kilometer-long Karakum Black Desert Canal from Amu Darya. And one of those mammoth projects that the Soviets loved to do was this main canal. Because what it did is it showed Soviet strength. But it was enormously costly in terms of the environment. There are estimates that around 50% of the water that passes through this canal somehow seeps out along its way to irrigated fields. So it never actually makes it into the irrigated fields. Irrigation is increasingly important as Central Asia goes from about 3 million hectares under irrigation in 1900 to 8 million in the 1980s. Apart from irrigation, most people get their drinking water from these two rivers. So having never paid for this, they've used the water at will. If you walk around Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, I can especially speak for Uzbekistan, you find fountains all over the place. You find people spraying their yards, hovli, these yards, just to keep the dust down. But there's very liberal uses of water. Sidewalks and streets are constantly watered just to keep the heat down in the summer. So very liberal uses of water. And all this means the desiccation of the land. The Aral Sea gets little or no water. And the result is the sea's disappearance. I thought that I had a great picture of this, but I must have put it somewhere else. The water that... Oh, sorry. There you go. The water that's supposed to go into the Aral Sea is disappearing in irrigation, and the result is the Aral Sea is drying up. You've got the sea declining in volume and surface area, and also increased toxicity of the sea. The water that makes it to the Aral Sea contains high concentrations of chemicals. Again, these fertilizers, these pesticides, and this goes into an increasingly small bucket of water. So as a result, fish and plant life are dying out. Fishermen have nothing to live off of. The area that's around the Aral Sea is also dangerous. You've got high salinity of the desert that used to be the lake that prevents plant life from developing. So instead what you get are dust storms that move far and wide, damaging the soil all around and hurting crop yields as well. Then you've got climate change, perhaps on top of what the rest of us feel, which leads to harsher winters and harsher summers and shorter growing seasons, this sort of microclimate of Central Asia, which is the product of all this catastrophe. You've got less productive soil. You've got shorter growing seasons because of all this. And now you've got this classic collective action problem that I was just referring to a second ago, where everyone's suffering as a result of the environmental damage, but no one's willing to be the guy who pays to clean it up. So imagine, less production means lots more people are out of work. Cutting water usage means anger from people who are accustomed to using whatever water they want, however they see fit, to make life that could be in a relatively painful climate a little bit easier. And so now you can understand why water issues are fundamental to Central Asia as well. So, with independence, during perestroika first, there were cuts from the center, which meant lower allocations for everything from transport and construction to social services. The center was simply giving less money to the periphery. So remember why some elites hope to use mass discontent. They hope to use it to get greater funds from the center. As Glasnost goes into full swing by the end of the 1980s, intellectuals were attacking their relationship with the center. Intellectuals around the periphery, around Central Asia and other republics. And in Central Asia, they were especially attacking their position with regards to cotton. And this was in the official press at that. So according to one report, for example, Central Asians were getting about 4 times less than the world price for their cotton. Others said that Central Asia was worse off under the Soviet Union than they had been under the Tsar. 1 kilogram of cotton back under the Tsar would have gotten you a cow. Now it would get you about 15 boxes of matches. In contrast to much of the Soviet Union under perestroika, there were really no major economic reforms attempted in the much more conservative Central Asia, just half measures at best. And this reticence was closely tied to the fear of giving up political power. All the while, these republic-level elites in Central Asia wanted a stronger center that could keep them going. So they were playing this dual game. So there were some good things that were left behind by the Soviet system. Education was much better than before. Society had changed a bit in terms of increased percentage of women being educated, for example. More women working in Central Asia than ever before. Still, it was around 40 to 45% of women in the workforce, but certainly an improvement. There was also greater technological know-how. If it was especially coveted by the Russians, held by the Russians, at least they had the technological know-how in the region. Again, another fear for the brain drain. In terms of infrastructure, you suddenly had these paved roads, railroads, telephones, all these things. They were skewed. The roads might go through various borders, as I mentioned with Tajikistan, to keep the republics together, but better than nothing. They also weren't the best quality. I remember distinctly driving in that little Tico that I mentioned a while back. It was actually a different Tico, same kind of car, and going across railroad tracks. And here you go across railroad tracks, and it's like, doo-doo. There we went across railroad tracks, and they were about 4 inches off the ground. It was like, boom, boom! Sorry, that must hurt. But so the quality wasn't the best. Telephones. You pick up a telephone, even in the 2000s in Uzbekistan, I'd pick up the telephone, and there was a good chance that I would hear multiple conversations that other people would have. Just if I picked it up and started dialing a number. As the phone was ringing or as I was trying to talk to someone, I'd hear other people's conversations. The sanitation, there are lots of issues. But they got all these things that they didn't have before. So remember that Central Asia was a net beneficiary from Moscow. But still, Central Asians hoped that once they controlled their own resources, which are raw materials for the most part, they could do much better on the world markets in terms of cotton, in terms of gas, and in terms of oil. But here's the economy as we know it. When they were forced out on their own, Central leaders tried to stay economically as close as they could to the old center. So they maintained the ruble, for example, as well as most of their major trade links to the extent that they could, or that it was profitable. Very tough economic conditions that they encountered upon independence meant that they frequently had to deal with each other, often on barter. I'll trade you oil for your gas, or gas for your potatoes or your coal. But they were not affected equally when the terms of trade went from local to global. Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan did best. They did best because they had the oil and the natural gas. And best means they did much better than before. Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, however, did worse. The big problems with independence started with losing money from the center. Again, Central Asia was a net beneficiary of subsidies from the center under the Soviet Union, and they now saw all this dashed. It all just disappeared like that. Across Central Asia, but especially outside of Kazakhstan and Turkestan, where oil and gas helped keep the economy up, despite the loss of these subsidies, you saw increased poverty and the emergence of a have versus have-nots dilemma. The haves are the people who are prospering under the new free market democracy, or at least free market system, or at least kind of free market system. The have-nots are the ones who are suffering. Diets changed. Meat and dairy, for the most, became a luxury rather than the staple that it used to be. Unemployment increased. You had an increase in crime as the have-nots struggled to be part of the haves. Everyone felt inflation in the first couple years of transition, but the states that were most conservative, i.e. those who had less free market, gung-ho movements, felt it less. This was especially Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, which were less willing to loosen price controls. Of course, by keeping these price controls, these economies were non-competitive and didn't have access to higher quality market goods from the West or elsewhere. And the diversity of policies around the region put pressure on the ruble. Some were going free market, others were statist, yet they were all using the same currency, and this became difficult. Finally, each state launched its own currency in 1993 at Russia's prompting. Russia didn't want them to maintain the ruble zone. Declines in economic output were generally highest in the states that pursued liberalization fastest. So even with its oil, you had a fall in economic output in Kazakhstan, and also in Kyrgyzstan. Of course, those that were less inclined to reform saw major budget imbalances because they no longer had Moscow's subsidies. And so they were forced with either having to stop providing services or watch their economies die. And they chose the latter. And there was a steep difference, for example, between the official currency value and the black market rates as they tried to maintain their economies. So, for example, the Uzbek sum, when I was there in 2000, was at, it was $1, and you traded $1 in, you got 200 sum. But on the black market, you gave $1 to someone and you got 1,000 sum, 5 times higher. And this gives way to all these little perverse things that happen. For example, diplomats would convert their money at the official rate. They would convert their dollars at the unofficial, the black market rate. So you'd give $10 and you get 10,000 sum, and then they would convert it back at the official rate. And so that 10,000 sum now divided by 200, well, you're going to get a lot more. So you're going to end up with 50,000. Sorry, this is a little math error. I shouldn't even try math while I'm talking. Well, you're going to get 5 times as much back. Oh, you're gonna get instead of $10, you're gonna get $50 back if you convert it back. Does that make sense? That makes sense. So, for example, I don't think a lot of people took advantage of this from that perspective. It was actually a one-time thing. You could only reconvert your money one time when you were leaving. But I bought a car. I bought all these things when I was there, and then I sold them for dirt cheap to my Uzbek friends. They got these things for dirt cheap, and I got all my money back, right? Because that's just the way the difference was between the black market and the official rate. I hope the Uzbeks aren't listening to this. I hope the State Department knows what's going on. Anyway, so the multiple exchange rates that I just mentioned are really convenient for the regime. Because what do? Well, they foster loyalty and privilege for those who get on board with the regime. Because those people get the favor of cheap access to hard currency, right? An overvalued Uzbek sum, so they could, or whatever the currency is. Unfortunately, of course, if you weren't a diplomat, it was much harder to buy dollars. And if you don't have dollars, or if you're not in with the new regime and you can't get those dollars, then you're not going to be able to buy lots of the goods that you want to get. Foreign investors wound up with masses of sums. This was a big problem that were worthless outside the country. They came in, they invested, they changed their money at the official rate, no less, changed all their dollars into sum. They made these major investments, and then they had bucket loads of sum that they were getting out of their investments. Coca-Cola or Pepsi, I can't remember which one it was. John Deere tractors. They were earning a lot of money, but they were all sum that the state wouldn't let them switch back into dollars because the state wanted to keep its dollars to keep the people within the regime happy and give them these favors. So this made for a disastrous investment climate. And more investors tried to stay away and did stay away. So the Central Asian economy today remains overwhelmingly based on economic structures that are still oriented towards raw materials. For Kazakhstan, for Turkmenistan, and for Uzbekistan, this could be great because it's based on oil and gas. But these are all raw materials that are easily manipulated. Prices go up and down. They're good times now, but they won't last forever. The Norwegians, for example, an advanced democracy with lots of oil, they tend to save their oil money during windfalls. It's much less clear what Central Asian elites do. In fact, there's evidence that the elites have been putting windfall profits into their own offshore bank accounts. You also need major investment to get the oil and gas. It's deep underground, it's under high pressure, so you need technology. Oil also has high sulfide content. All this means you need serious investment in technology and in your capacities to get the oil out and to market. And in a place like Uzbekistan, you haven't had the same degree of investment as you have in Kazakhstan, which is more democratic and has more rule of law. In other words, I want to be sure that I can recoup my investment. I can go to the courts if the government does something and get it back. In Uzbekistan, that's not going to happen. In Kazakhstan, it probably is. Now, the other major raw material in which so many Central Asians are involved, we talked a lot about today, is cotton. Cotton is a forced labor industry. It's not year-round work, it's seasonal. The U.S. uses migrant labor in agriculture. Central Asian states, which are closed in terms of their borders and poor, use forced labor. In other words, the kids don't go to school for a few months a year so that they can go out and be in the fields. All this puts the future of the youth at stake, with education declining as students spend up to 60, 70 plus school days harvesting cotton. So imagine, after independence, having so many people who grew up in a system where they kept missing school. At the end of the day, we're talking about missed years, not months. So all these problems continue today, and we'll talk a little bit more about the economies in the next set of lectures.